Yeah, well, first of all, there are a few groups that meet to sing Ladino songs together. There were some attempts to introduce Ladino songs or Judezmo songs into the school system and in choirs in Israel. I'm basically speaking about Israel. But I would say the main method of transmission these days is actually to listen to recorded music. You can speak about, let's say, the period before the late 19th century and the period after. Until the late 19th century, I would say that people learned the songs from their parents, from their family. Women learned the songs from the women in the family and sang while they worked to help pass the time. The men were out working and then generally had no time to sing during the day, but the women did. But after that period ended and women started to go out to work, they also didn't have so much time, I guess, to spend singing at home, except for the housewives. And with technological developments, printed books, printed songbooks began to be published, things of the kind that Yaakov Yonah printed in Salonika and Binyamin Raphael Ben Yosef printed in Istanbul. And these gave people certain set variants of songs, and in a way it helped put an end to the variety, because once I think Judezmo culture was very varied, because people were transmitting these texts orally, and they would change, from generation to generation, from person to person. The text would change a bit. But when they started to sing from printed books, everybody started to sing the same texts. And especially when they started to make recordings of singers from the late 19th century on, especially the early 20th century, people started to learn the songs from recordings. One of the people in the United States who was in a way influential was Gloria Levy, who produced a folkways record of Ladino songs. But even before that, there were singers in the old country like Chaim Effendi, even Rosa Eskenazi, who was in Greece and Turkey, who sang some Judezmo songs. And once these records were out and they were sold widely, people learned the variants that these singers were singing. And that was, in a way, the end of the variety. Yitzchak Levi in Israel collected both liturgical singing, liturgical songs, and popular songs, the folk music repertoire. And from the time that he published his collections, people like Yehoram Gaon, Ran Eliran, started to produce records, long-playing records, I guess in maybe the 60s, the 70s. And those are basically the songs that became the most popular because people could learn them easily. All you needed was a record and a record player, and you could learn the whole tradition at home by yourself. But you were also singing the exact same words that Yehoram Gaon had sung, and you didn't necessarily pass it on to anybody else. So it became a kind of a technological tradition that's passed on through recorded music. Yeah, I don't know if, women, for example, mothers are singing to their children anymore and passing on the tradition the way it was once transmitted. I think it's an entirely different world today. The liturgical music, I guess people learned in the synagogues. There were also specialists in liturgical singing who would teach younger people. And it didn't begin then, it began long before, especially in Edirne with the Maftirim, who had a whole repertoire. They would sing some of the songs of Yisrael Najara from the 16th century, and they focused on the texts and also the music, and had groups, choral groups, who sang, men of course. And then, of course, people who went to the synagogue regularly learned the tradition simply from hearing a chazan and the other people in the synagogue sing. So from childhood, these were learned. Also to an extent in celebrations like Pesach, Passover, where people would sit at the Passover table and sing the Haggadah. According to the Sephardic tradition, it's sung alternately in Hebrew and Ladino, and then at the end there are a few table songs that are sung in Ladino. And people learned, I remember in Brooklyn at the Sephardic Home for the Aged, women who couldn't necessarily read Hebrew, but they could recite the text from memory, since they had learned it when they were girls. So that was, in a sense, something of the oral tradition being passed on. Now, in Israel, we have a problem, I guess, throughout the world, except in Turkey and Greece, and maybe to a small extent in Yugoslavia, Bulgaria. The problem is that it's a kind of musical system that is very different from the musical system of the majority. And in Israel, we have a problem that although some of the surrounding music, you could say, is Oriental, but it's not Ottoman in style, neither in the quarter tones or the performance style, the vocal style. So this is something that seems to be very difficult for the younger generations to learn, and they start using the Arabic Jews style instead. So it's really a tradition that's being lost, except in places like Istanbul. I haven't been to Izmir, maybe they're still keeping it up. In Salonika, it's also a problem because I think the younger Chazanim are no longer Judezmo speakers. In the United States, there are still a few, but they're mostly older people. And after them, I don't know what condition the tradition will be left in. So it's an endangered tradition, the liturgical Sephardic, the real Judezmo speakers' liturgical tradition. Well, I mean, if people learn songs from the recordings, on the one hand, it in a way ensures the transmission. It will survive in some form, although it'll be a very standardized form. Everybody will be singing the same songs, using the same words and the same melodies. On the other hand, to use the true Ottoman Jewish musical system is the challenge because of the vocal style and the distinctive quarter tones. I think it will be very difficult for that to be transmitted. There are some attempts are being made, both on the part of the speakers and their descendants, and also on the part of others, non-Jews, who are interested in this music and are trying to perform it in their own way. So the challenge is somehow to maintain this tradition, and I guess if it's of concern to people, to try to keep it as close to the original tradition as possible. But we see that people are doing all kinds of things with this tradition. So I guess, the Judezmo speakers are very open to change, to the surroundings, to all kinds of innovative attempts to perform their music. So I think they'll be happy no matter what happens. As long as it's kept up in some way, I think they'll be pretty happy with it. Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe for the speech group itself, everything can be changed. I think if the words are kept, and in Israel it's even common for the Judezmo songs to be translated into Hebrew, and keeping more or less the same melody to maintain the songs, to keep them alive through Hebrew versions. I guess maybe the text is the most important thing. If possible, to retain it in Judezmo. It would be nice if something of the original flavor of the musical style, the instrumentation is retained, but I don't think the speakers themselves are that concerned with maintaining that. I guess it says something about their approach to the fluidity of their culture. It's interesting. I think among the Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim, there's more of a sense of there's a certain authentic Yiddish style of singing and music, and we should really try to maintain that. But among the Judezmo speakers, I think there's much more of an openness to change, that they're willing to accept all kinds of change. The main thing is that it survives in some form. So what's the minimum? I guess the language, if possible, although I say that in Israel, even the songs sometimes are sung in Hebrew. And I guess maybe they're happy, but I guess that's not really the true Judezmo transmission. So I guess the text should be retained. And then with the melody, if people are concerned with maintaining the traditional forms, then they should go for the vocal style, the Ottoman quarter tones, the original instruments, the Turkish instruments, the oud, the tambur, and so on. But if that isn't possible, then I guess whatever musical form it takes will keep the tradition alive in some form. And that, I guess, is the most important thing.